Today we're reading from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 16. It was by faith that Abraham, when God called him, obeyed and went out to a place where he was to receive an inheritance. Off he went, not knowing where he was going. It was by faith that he stayed in the promised land as a stranger, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, who were joint heirs of the same promise. He was looking ahead, you see, to the city which has foundations, the city of which God is the designer and builder. It was by faith that Sarah herself, who was barren, received the ability to conceive a child, even when long past the right age, since she considered that God, who had promised, was trustworthy. Thus it came about that from one man, and him more or less dead, there was born a family as many as the stars of heaven in number, as uncountable as the sand on the seashore. All these people died in faith. They hadn't received the promise, but they'd seen it from far off and had greeted it, and had recognized that they were strangers and wanderers in the land. People who say that sort of thing, you see, make it clear that they are looking for a homeland. Had they been thinking of the place from which they had set out, they would have had plenty of opportunity to go back to it. But as it was, they were longing for a better place, a heavenly one. That's why God is not ashamed to be called their God, since he has prepared a city for them.
Thank you very much. That's a famous faith chapter, Hebrews 11. A lot of different saints are commended there by the author of Hebrews. We're not sure who it was that wrote Hebrews. I saw a recent study claiming that Barnabas might have written it, but it's been an ongoing dispute in the seminaries and among theologians. But anyway, whoever wrote it, we're glad it's in there, and we're glad those stories of the Hebrew patriarchs and so forth are there for us to consider. So Abraham, if you remember, or Abram was his name when he was born, was from the city of Ur. He was called out of, the Old Testament says he was called out of the Ur of the Chaldeans. And Ur, for thousands of years, the church didn't know much about Ur. But Ur was just rediscovered in the mid-1800s. An explorer found some potsherds with strange, look like markings on it. It's what we now know as cuneiform type. What cuneiform means wedge. So it was clay tablets that when the clay was soft, they would press a wedge into the tablet and make various shapes. And that was the type of text that was used in Ur. So just less than a month ago now, Matt and I went to a conference on Ur. It's called Ur in the 21st Century down at the University of Pennsylvania. It's an annual conference that happens in different places all around the world, and I was completely over my head at it, but Matt was loving it. It was called the 62nd Rencontre Assyriologique Internationale. So it was a whole conference of Assyriologists, liturgists, linguists, archaeologists, historians, whose specialty is this ancient Mesopotamian area and time period. Prior to the coming of Christ, going back as far as 4,000 or 5,000 years prior to that. So Abram was from, the Bible tells us, from this ancient city, Mesopotamian city of Ur. So to get started today, I'll talk a little bit about what we know of that city where Abram came from. Because I think it's interesting, and for centuries the church didn't have the benefit of this knowledge of what the societies, what the cultures were like that many of these patriarchs arose from and came from. So I think if we pay attention to that, we'll better understand what Abram was leaving behind when he left Ur, and maybe what he was looking forward to going away from there. So the ruins of the city were extensively excavated between 1922 and 1934 by a British archaeologist named Sir Leonard Woolley in conjunction with the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania's museum. There are new excavations planned, I think starting in 2017 and 18. And we sat through a seminar with a young woman who's been preparing. She has like 3 years of prep work before they go and start the excavations. And a lot of that, the prep work is being done by looking at recently declassified spy satellite images and U-2 spy plane images back from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Because it's hard to believe, but the images from those spy satellites and planes show discoloration in the soil and the sand around the city of Ur, and that helps them to see the boundaries of where the city expanded to years ago. Even after all these years, the soil is still discolored in that region. This large structure in the background of the photo here is called a ziggurat. It's a Mesopotamian version of a pyramid. Like you'd see pyramids in Egypt, but in Mesopotamia they built ziggurats. But they weren't typically tombs like the pyramids were in Egypt, where they would entomb their pharaohs in these pyramids. These ziggurats functioned more like temples. This is a large one. I think it's the largest one that they've discovered. It was actually all covered with sand. And all of these ruins were covered with sand. Over the years, the sand had just blown in, and so when they discovered that ziggurat, it just looked like a hill. But as they removed sand, they encountered the walls of the ziggurat that was built. It's about 70 feet tall, so it was a major construction project when it was built. And then you also see some of the walls of the city buildings there. And they were pretty good brick masons, as you can see from the walls. These walls, these go back to 2,000-3,000 years BC. So it's amazing that they're still there, but there they are. So Ur is located in southern Iraq, southeastern Iraq in the modern day, near the Persian Gulf, as you see on the map there. So when Abram left Ur and headed toward the Promised Land, or Canaan, you could see he would have been traveling, probably they think he traveled up the Euphrates River for some period, some distance, and then the text says that he and his family settled in Haran, which is another city a bit northwest of Ur that was very similar to Ur, although much smaller. And then they would have headed more westerly over by the Dead Sea. Of course, between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea is where we'd find modern-day Israel and Jerusalem. Ur is located near the confluence of the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. It was in the region of Sumer, and actually, when it was a thriving city, it was a port city. The Persian Gulf expanded up to where you see Ur on the map here. But now Ur is about 16 kilometers inland from the Persian Gulf. So the combination of siltation from these two rivers and climate change has made it so Ur no longer is a port city, but when it was thriving, it was actually a port city on the Persian Gulf. Also, the course of the Euphrates River has changed over these years. The Euphrates River used to run right through or next to the city of Ur. Now it's considerably east. So the river course has changed, of course, over years too. That was something I found interesting when I started looking at archaeology. When you look for old riverbeds, you don't look for depressions. You look for places that are built up, because all the siltation actually builds the soil, and because it's been settling for so many years, that as the soil rises and rises in the riverbed, then it forces the river into another place. And so that's how they find actually ancient river beds are not depressions, they're actually like strips of mounds. So Ur was continuously inhabited from somewhere in the mid 4th millennium BC. They have records of people living there as long ago as the mid 4th millennium, up to about 450 BC, when the Persian Empire was kind of sweeping through this area. And also it looks like by that time the Persian Gulf had receded a significant amount. Maybe the Euphrates River had changed, and it made it more difficult. The climate was becoming more arid. It was more difficult to live there and raise cattle and raise livestock. So by 450 BC, the population of Ur had dissipated to a large extent. Most scholars believe that Abram lived early in the second millennium BC, around 1900 BC. It's hard to tell exactly, but that's kind of the best work right now. So if that was when Abram lived, about 1900 years BC, that would have been during what's called the Ur-3 period, the period between 2047 and 1750 BC. And this was the height of the Sumerian civilization at Ur. This Ur-3 period was when Ur was really a kicking city. It was a major civilization. That time is known as the Sumerian Renaissance. Ur was a center of learning and culture at that time. It was a wealthy port city. There's evidence that they traded with countries as far away as India, even at that time, 2,000 years BC. The great ziggurat that we saw in that picture of Ur dates from that same period, as do most of the ruins of the city. And there were thousands of these cuneiform tablets found there, many of those dating from that time period. The king at that time period, King Ur-Nammu, wrote the first codified law system in that whole region during this time. And it was about 300 years before Hammurabi wrote the Hammurabi Code. So if you studied in world history in school, you may have learned about the Hammurabi Code as being one of the earliest codes of law. Predates the Moses Law by quite a few hundred years. The king of Ur actually had written a code prior to that, and we saw a stone with much of that code written on it at the University of Pennsylvania. So this is all well before Moses, the giving of the Hebrew law on the Mount Sinai. So they found a number of artifacts. Here are a couple of the more striking ones in the city of Ur. The one on the left, Leonard Woolley named it a ram in a thicket. And you can see it looks like a goat, and because he was thinking of the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac when he was exploring Ur. In fact, this was probably created well before Abraham and Isaac would have had that encounter on Mount Sinai. But it makes me wonder, was there some kind of a Sumerian story involving a ram in a thicket or a goat in a thicket that predated the experience that Abraham had with Isaac? We don't know for sure, but it's interesting. And then there's a silver lyre was discovered, because at this time, this Renaissance period in Ur, the arts were flourishing, so the music would have been a significant part of their cultural life there. So a lyre to create music, kind of like a harp, was discovered and restored. There's a bull's head. You can see it on the front of that lyre. And you wonder what that is about. Well, the god, first of all, Ur was a polytheistic society, like most of the Mesopotamian cultures were. But each of these cultures would have a premier or a master god that was over all of the other gods in their pantheon. And the master god for the city of Ur was the moon god named Nana. So we have that famous worship song to na 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 na, right? Now that's still surviving to this day. Goodbye. That god was also referred to as Nana Sin or Nana Suin, and as different leaders, would take over cities and they'd be conquered, sometimes the gods would change, like a different culture would come in and they'd establish their god as the premier one. But for many centuries, the moon god was the primary god in Ur, and especially the crescent moon. And the horns on a bull looked kind of like a crescent moon, and so they saw cattle as divine in some way. So they had large herds of cattle around the city of Ur at the time too. Nana bestowed fertility and prosperity on the cowherds, governing the rise of the waters, the growth of reeds, the increase of the herd, and therefore the quantity of dairy products produced. So that was the primary god that was worshipped at the time. Now, as Woolley started excavating the city of Ur, and this was back in the early 1900s when they didn't do it as carefully as they do today. They had as many as 300 people, local people, working on the dig at one time, and it is a massive site. But I think they probably destroyed a lot. But adjacent to his big excavation, just near the end of it, he started digging a little bit next to the city, and he found evidence of a huge royal cemetery. And that's what they've called it, the Royal Cemetery of Ur. And it was very interesting in that it was large chambers underground, and they would find various kings or queens entombed there. But along with the king or the queen were their family, members of their family, and members of their court or their servants would all be entombed when the king or the queen died together in these big chambers. So you see the excavation going underway there back in the late, I think in the mid-1930s. And this has given us quite an insight into how they thought about sacrifice. Back in the 1920s and 30s, many of the skulls that were found had been fractured and were difficult to tell exactly how people had died. And they know from other places in Mesopotamia that sometimes when a king would die, they would give poison to the king's court, and then they would bury those people together with the king. But it appears that that wasn't the case in Ur. A 2009 article in New York Times describes the tombs as this way. A new examination of skulls from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, discovered in Iraq almost a century ago, appears to support a more grisly interpretation than before of human sacrifices associated with elite burials in ancient Mesopotamia. Palace attendants, as part of a royal mortuary ritual, were not dosed with poison to meet a rather serene death. Instead, a sharp instrument, a pike perhaps, was driven into their heads. Archaeologists at the University of Pennsylvania reached that conclusion after conducting the first CT scans of skulls from the 4,500-year-old cemetery. The cemetery, with 16 tombs, grand in construction and rich in gold and jewels, was discovered in the 1920s, a sensation in 20th century archaeology. It revealed the splendor at the height of the Mesopotamian civilization. So it appears that human sacrifice was commonplace, that sometimes family members, royal palace attendants were sacrificed along with, at the time that their ruler had died, and they were entombed together. Not exactly what we would think about happening today. Huh? And we have evidence all over this region, the Mesopotamian region, of what we call foundational sacrifices. This is the idea that when a city or a new wall, a protection wall or a significant government building was built, often a child of the leader at that time would be sacrificed and placed in the foundation of the new building or wall that was being constructed. The idea was that if the leader of the country would sacrifice, a child, a baby, or a virgin daughter, and place that infant or adolescent in the foundation wall of the city, then it would bring prosperity to the city. The gods would look favorably on that. And so we find evidence. Here's a couple of examples here. The picture on the left is a tomb in an infant cemetery in Megiddo. You see down at the bottom there's enclosed the skeleton of an infant, and then on the right in that picture is a foundational sacrifice found. Where was that one found? In Giza. So all across the region, foundational sacrifices were commonplace. The Bible even makes mention of this practice in a couple of places. In 1 Kings 16, we read this: in the days of Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. So when Jericho was built, it says he laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub. So this was a common practice that was happening all around this region. One of the presenters at the conference Matt and I went to was a guy named Dominique Charpin, And I bought this book of his called Gods, Kings, and Merchants in Old Babylonian Mesopotamia. We're really nerding out now, right? Gods, Kings, and Merchants in Old Babylon and Mesopotamia. He chose that name as a way of indicating that religion, politics, and the economy, God, kings, and merchants, religion, politics, and the economy, all functioned in a much more connected and fluid way than we think of those three spheres today. We tend to think of religion, politics, and the economy as separate spheres that do have some overlap and some interplay, but that was not the way they thought of those things at the time, in the time Abram would have lived in Ur. Those were very closely connected. They were understood not as separate areas at all, but as one big way that the world functioned. The religion, politics, and the economy all were fluidly linked together. So the way this worked there were prophets, just like we talk about biblical prophets and how the biblical prophets spoke to kings and so forth. This happened in ancient Mesopotamia also. Prophets would go to a temple. They would sometimes prophesy in the temple. Sometimes they'd have a dream and a dream interpretation, or they'd practice some kind of an incantation. Scribes would write down those prophecies. They'd deliver those prophecies to the king, and the king would make divine decrees because there was no separation in their thinking between kings and gods. The kings were put in place by the gods, so religion and politics were very closely knit together. These prophets would prophesy in the temples. These prophecies would be taken to the kings would issue divine decrees, edicts, if you will. They were political in nature and had impacts on the way the economy functioned, on the way people were paid. Whether or not to go to war was all driven in this kind of worldview that saw religion, politics, and the economy all as being the same, under the same umbrella. Many of the tablets that were found at Ur and other ancient sites like that are actually records of payments that are made or were made in the form of meat that was sacrificed in these temples. So often people were paid by receiving meat from the temple sacrifices. And we even hear about this, Paul talking to people in Rome and so forth, about should we eat meat sacrificed to idols? This was a big question in the New Testament period. So this practice goes back thousands of years, even before the New Testament period. So a lot of the detailed accounting records are preserved on these tablets, which are very interesting. Matthew's learning to read these things. I haven't got a clue, but it was interesting to listen to people who can do that. Here's one of the most interesting finds from Ur. This is called the Standard of Ur, and it's engraved on all four sides. And this side they call the war side. So if you notice down at the bottom, across that strip on the bottom, you see chariots and horses. And then if you look closely underneath the horses, you'll see bodies of people laying there. And then you see up on the next, in the middle panel, there are prisoners being paraded. And then on the top panel, those prisoners come before the king. Right in the middle, you see the figure of the king. And then behind the king are his attendants and his own chariot. So this is all illustrating the practice of war in ancient Mesopotamia. There would be... And then on the opposite side of this standard, what's called the peace side, you see the civilization of Ur characterized in a time of peace, where there's harvesting going on down in the bottom. There's up near the top, you see people doing music and art and those sort of things. So the idea in this standard was that the peaceful dynasty of Ur was assured by the military conquests on the other side of the standard. This is how people understood things. We can live at peace when we conquer our enemies militarily. So I'll show you a short animation of what Ur might have looked like in the time of Abraham. And it's just a couple of minutes long, but it's a fairly representative animation. Here we go. Okay, his little idea, all been reclaimed by the sands of time since then. Okay. So this was the society Abram and his family would have known, would have been commonplace, would have been completely normal to them. He would have grown up in a prosperous port city, in a period of cultural renaissance, in a center of learning and trade, but a culture that was thoroughly embedded in an ancient Near Eastern worldview. Kings, gods, merchants, religion, politics, and the economy all blended together. Prophets acted as messengers between gods and kings. Nana Sin, the moon god, was the primary deity. This massive ziggurat was constructed on the scale of the Egyptian pyramids, but functioned more as a temple. Kings made divine decrees. Peace was ensured by military might. It was a thoroughly sacrificial culture. Sacrifices of animals, grain, humans were common, uncontested, expected, and completely normal. It was the way the world worked. It was a thriving civilization, one of the most successful cities in the ancient Near East. This is what Abram leaves to go to Canaan. He leaves that. And we read about it in Genesis 11. Terah, this is Abram's father, Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, and his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So Haran was another city similar to Ur, worshipped the same God, was of the same cultural worldview at the time, but it was a smaller city, and we're not sure how long they stayed there. But Abram left with his father, his nephew, and his wife. They settled in Haran for a while until Terah, his father, died, and then they continued on toward Canaan. And that brings us to our text today in Hebrews 11. We started with verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he set out not knowing where he was going. So think about that in the context of growing up in that really fabulous ancient Near Eastern city of Ur. God asks you to leave, but he doesn't tell you where you're going. Just go. Just get out of the only place you know, the only civilization you know. Just get up and leave. You won't know where you're going to go. But in the next verse, we see that he was looking for something. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So understanding where he came from and understanding that he was looking for something different, that he had some idea that God, and of course growing up in Ur, God to him was one of these polytheistic gods, or even the moon god, Nana. But he's starting to hear something from a different God. He's starting to hear a different voice. A different divinity is starting to break through to Abram. And he has this sense that there's another way to live. There's a different way to live in community than the way he'd been brought up. That's what I think he's saying. He's looking for a city whose foundations, or who is a city that's founded on something different, by a different God. And he was looking for a new way to live in community. So when God called Abraham out of Ur, he was asking Abram to leave Ur behind. I don't think it only meant to leave the physical city-state of Ur behind. I think he meant God was calling him to leave the Ur way of living behind. So it wasn't just the location he was leaving. He wasn't just exploring to set up another Ur somewhere else, because this clearly says he was looking for a different kind of city, something that was fundamentally different than the city he'd grown up in. A city whose architect and builder was God, not Nana Sin, the moon god, but the God that we understand now as being the Father of Jesus Christ. Why is the writer of Hebrews telling us all this? It's all in the Old Testament. So why is he bringing this back to mind? I think he's telling us this because as followers of Jesus, we have the same call on us. I think he's taking this ancient story of God calling Abram out of the way of life that he understood, the only way of life he understood, and telling him to seek a different way of life. I think that speaks to us today as followers of Jesus. That's really the call that we have, that Jesus calls us with when he says to follow me. He's asking us not just to, like we've been taught, a lot of us, not just to say a prayer and then you're good to go. You've got your ticket to heaven. No, he's asking us to really reconsider everything that we've understood before, everything about the way we've lived and all of the default understandings that we've had, and look for a city that's founded differently than that. To begin to look for a different way to live and form communities. For us, it might not mean leaving our physical homes, but it surely means learning what it means to live in a way that God has designed and built for humanity to live in. It will surely be different than we were taught to expect, especially since we too are living in a modern empire state with some similarities to Ur. And I don't think he was just talking about the afterlife here. This is the way I read it for years, but if you read verse 13 and 14, all of these died, and he's referring to all of the different saints that have been mentioned in Hebrews 11. We're just reading about Abram here. But all of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. So all these saints that are commended for their faith lived into what they saw. In other words, they didn't just go and wait for something to happen. They started living into what they had faith for. So much so that they were considered strangers and foreigners on the earth. That the way they started living seemed completely alien and foreign to the regular people in their society. I think this is important for us Christians today. For much of my life, I lived with an expectation of just this is all just headed toward a heavenly city and in the afterlife. But the writer of Hebrews here says we should be living now as if we have found the city whose architect and builder is God. That's what faith is living now as if we found that city. We will confess that we are strangers and foreigners on the earth, and will appear as aliens to those who accept the narrative of the society that we came from. This really is the subversive call of the Christian today. But a lot of people don't heed that call. He goes on in verse 15 and says, if they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. So even if you get the call and Jesus says, come, follow me, he's not going to force us to follow him. Just like he didn't force Abram to continue on this journey toward Canaan, he had plenty of opportunity to go back. He had plenty of opportunity to say, I'm not sure I like living as a stranger and an alien with all of these people around me. I'm misunderstood all the time. People don't understand, what I'm trying to do, how I'm trying to live together with people. It doesn't make sense. So there's always plenty of opportunity to go back to Ur, to go back to where you came from. But faith calls us forward. It says God has prepared a city for them. Not will prepare a city for them. God already has prepared this city. I think what faith means for us today is to start living into that city, living into the kind of culture that Jesus already demonstrated and prepared for us. Remember verse 10, for he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. See, that's what we're called to look forward to. We'll look not just as something off in the distance in the future, but something we can actually start demonstrating with the way we live today. This reminds me of something that Jesus said when the chief priests and the Pharisees were challenging him about his authority. And we sang about it earlier with that new song that I kind of muffed up a bit. But anyway, it's in Matthew 21:42. Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. So Jesus was referring to himself here as the cornerstone of the foundation of something new. You see that? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Jesus is referring to himself. He's quoting, I think, Psalm 119 here, but he's taking that Psalm from 119 and he's applying it to himself, saying, I'm the cornerstone of the foundation of something new, a new way of forming communities, a new way of being human together. Remember when we talked about foundational sacrifices? Often the bodies of those that were sacrificed and placed in the foundations of city walls or protection walls were placed in the cornerstone or at the location of the cornerstone. So when Jesus says this, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, speaking of himself, what is he saying? He says, I'm the new foundational sacrifice. I'm the new sacrifice on which the city of God, the city whose builder and architect is God, is to be founded upon. But it's not a sacrifice to appease the gods like they thought in ancient Mesopotamia. It was a sacrifice to appease angry people. It was a sacrifice to show and to reveal to humans that it's us that needs sacrifice. It's us that needs to form communities around exclusion and sacrifice and scapegoating other people. But this is a different kind of city that Jesus is founding. It's the city that Abraham was looking for, the city he was living into, but it's a city that even today many Christians are pretty clueless about. I confess that, I was pretty clueless about it for most of my life. A city whose architect and builder is God, whose cornerstone foundational sacrifice is an innocent man, somebody that didn't need to be sacrificed, that only needed to be sacrificed because of what we felt was required. A city which doesn't make peace by waging war. That was the standard of Ur. Remember, it has a peace side and a war side. The only way they lived in peace was through waging war. A city, though, that makes peace by overcoming evil with good rather than overcoming evil with greater evil. I think that's what it might have meant to leave Ur behind. That was what I think Abraham was starting to get a glimpse of. Of course, he didn't have the benefit of Jesus like we do. And you can imagine what an act of faith that would have been for him to leave the only society, the only culture he knew, and to start questioning the very foundational assumptions that society was built upon. That's what the father of Judaism did. That's how Judaism started, was with this call to this man from this city called Ur. So, for discussion today, here's a couple of things. What would it mean to you today to leave Ur behind? What does it mean for us today to leave Ur behind? For God to call us out of Ur. What does it mean? And you can think of it either personally, what does it mean for you as individually, or what does it mean for us as a culture or as a group of Christians to be called out of Ur? What does that mean? It was such a change for Abram that God changed his name along the way to Abraham, which means what? It means he changed his identity. It was such a radical shift that God changed his identity in the process. I think maybe it should be that radical a change for us, that our actual identity has to be reconsidered. So, there you go. What do you think about leaving Ur?